This is Joseph Drust, and welcome back to another episode of AskZBrush. So we had a question sent in asking, how can I preserve polygroups when DynaMeshing? So to start off, I just have an example model here loaded in, and this model contains some polypainting, and then if I turn on my polyframes and disable line, it also contains polygroups as well. So the question is asking about having a model like this that contains polygrouping and then going to, say, the tool panel, geometry, DynaMesh area, and then creating a DynaMesh out of this so that it retains the polygrouping. So as an example with the mesh here, if I come down to the DynaMesh area in the geometry palette and then set my resolution to say 512, and now click DynaMesh, you'll see after it's done processing here, the model contains one single polygroup. So before it was a DynaMesh, you can see I had it broken out into these different polygroups. If I hold down Control and Shift with the Select Rectangle brush, I can isolate these. However, after I come over here and set a resolution and DynaMesh, I'm now ending up with one single polygroup only. So how can I get it so when I DynaMesh, I still retain the polygroups that I had on my model? So the one thing that is causing the polygroups to be removed when you DynaMesh is the fact that this model contains polypainting. So if I undo the change here to get back to the original version of the model and I turn off my polyframes, you can see it does contain polypaint information. So if I go back to the tool palette and I duplicate this mesh, and then with the duplicate version, I just turn off the polypaint by clicking on this little paintbrush icon here. You'll see it still contains the polygrouping. And now if I come here to the geometry tab, put the same resolution in at 512, and now click DynaMesh, you'll see I'm going to get a result and the polygrouping is going to be retained. So in order to retain the polygrouping when you DynaMesh, you need to make sure that the mesh does not contain any polypaint. So if the model has polypainting, when you use DynaMesh, it's going to keep the polypainting, however, it's going to remove the polygrouping. So if you want the polygroups, make sure you have the polypaint turned off. Now let's say I want the polypainting and the polygroups. So how can I go by getting that result? So to do this, what we need to do is just make a duplicate of our original tool. So here we had the original that has the polypainting and the polygroups. And now we have the duplicate version of it, which just contains the polygrouping. So with the version that only contains polygrouping and has the polypaint option turned off, we want to DynaMesh this one. We'll do that process here. And then after we have our DynaMesh result, now we can come back up here. We can turn on the eyeball icon for the original model that contains the polypainting. And now we can perform a project function from the DynaMesh version back to the original one to get the color information from the original model back to the newly DynaMeshed one. So selecting the version that has been DynaMeshed and still has the polygroups. Now go down to the project area here. I usually change the distance to 0.01. And I want to make sure that I have the Polypaint colorize option on for the subtool I've selected and also for the subtool I want to project from. And then now I'm going to click the project all button. This is going to now process. After this is done, I can hide my original model. And you'll see now I have the DynaMesh version. It still contains polygrouping. So if I hold down Control and Shift with the Select Rectangle brush, I can isolate those polygroups. And then if I turn off my polyframes, you'll see it also now has polypaint information. So to quickly recap, if you want to keep the polygrouping on your model, you need to make sure that the mesh contains no polypainting. If the mesh contains polypainting, when you perform the DynaMesh function by going down here to Tool, Geometry, DynaMesh, it will keep the polypainting over the polygrouping. So you want to make sure that if you want the polygrouping, that your model simply does not have any polypainting. And to toggle that off, you just need to go to the subtool area and toggle this little paintbrush icon here. And then when you perform that DynaMesh operation, it will retain the polygrouping and give you a DynaMeshed model. So if you have any other questions related to ZBrush pipelines or processes, please use the hashtag AskZBrush on Twitter. Happy ZBrushing!